Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Aliana Kernodle. This year, Chalkboard News covered the largest stories in education, from the Biden administration's changes to Title IX to student performance declines and the use of online credit recovery programs. Joining me to take a look back over 2024 is Chalkboard News editor Brennan Clary. Brennan, let's start with Title IX. What happened over the course of this year?
Yeah, so a lot happened with Title IX. I'd say that's one of the biggest developments in terms of, federal regulation, a lot of the different kinds of debates around that. I mean, it's just been a big year for a lot of boardroom discussions in the school board meetings about these cultural issues. And this is kind of at the heart of that. Basically, the Department of Education announced its final notice of proposed rulemaking, which is through a bureaucratic administrative process. They said, this is our additions and changes to Title IX. And we're releasing these. And if you're not aware, Title IX is a federal non-discrimination statute that's tied to funding. So any kind of education institution that receives federal funding is bound by the law. And essentially what the Department of Education did under the Biden administration was expand the law to include gender identity, which is the biggest, most controversial part of it, and some other expansions as well, including protections for pregnant students and that kind of thing. So there are some other ones that really aren't challenged that much. Nobody's really fighting about some of those things. But really what kind of gotten stuck in the cultural maw was the transgender and gender identity provisions, and that's what it expanded. So that happened in April of this year, and it was set for implementation on August 1st. And a number of different states, led by Republican attorneys general and some private organizations like Moms for Liberty, Young Americans for Freedom, they filed lawsuits. And again, I'm summarizing a lot of this stuff in a lot of different kinds of lawsuits, a lot of different kinds of litigation. They filed lawsuits, and it takes a while for those to go through the court system, and then kind of concentrated around that August 1st deadline. We saw these blocks from the courts. So the court said you can't implement these rules in this state, and here's why. And so basically, at this point, and this is kind of where we're stuck while we're waiting for the litigation to continue, is that over half of U.S. states have a block on this rule being implemented. And that also applies to thousands of individual schools. So it's a very piecemeal approach at this point in terms of implementation from the Department of Education point of view. There's thousands of schools, K-12 schools, and then also colleges and universities where they can't implement that rule. And they're continuing to argue about this stuff. Even as recently as last week, we saw oral arguments in a court of appeals over whether that injunction, that block on the rules implementation should continue. And so, of course, the Department of Education under the Biden administration has said, we should be able to implement the rule. But plaintiffs, private and also states, have said, no, you shouldn't be able to implement this while we're talking about it because we have that ability. So that's something that the courts are continuing to look at in different aspects. So in a nutshell, that's been one of the biggest things to talk about. A lot of critics say that this removes space for biological females and that it would make competition in sports unfair. And they point to the nature of Title IX and it's the point of it back in the 1970s when it was instituted was to protect women in these educational spaces in institutions of higher learning and K-12 schools, and provided them the opportunity to have competition that was fair and had girls sports teams or provided opportunities for them. So that's something that critics are talking about in regards to the changes. But proponents say that students should be protected in schools no matter what their gender identity is, whether they're transgender or non-binary, that, these sexual minority youth should be able to attend a school and not have to worry about hate or any kind of bullying or anything like that. So that's really a lot of the argument that you hear from the Biden administration and other advocates who are in favor of the expansion of Title IX.
And another big story this year has been student performance. What did 2024 show in that department?
Yeah, mostly it's bad news. So in a nutshell, we saw multiple national and international assessments that showed that students have not recovered their academic achievement to a pre-pandemic level. And specifically, the NWEA, which is an organization that measures nationwide performance, they said that students are, in some cases, an entire school year behind, and on average, at least a semester behind. And so that's a very difficult problem because it just requires more instruction time in order to catch up. And again, these are estimates and averages, but on average, students are still very far behind where they were before the pandemic. So there's a lot of catching up to do. And then again, with like an international assessment, it found that students have dropped in their test scores, in some cases to the lowest ever recorded, right, before the 1995 initial assessment. So that is the Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study Assessment. It just checks on math and science over time. So this was the first study, or the first assessment that had been conducted since 2019, and it just showed sort of a precipitous drop in academic achievement.
And online credit recovery programs were a big story this year at Chalkboard News specifically. Give us a recap.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different facets to this, and we've covered this. And I think that that's something that makes Chalkboard News stand out in terms of its reporting on this, is that a lot of other outlets haven't reported on this the same way, are not as familiar with the research, and haven't gone out of their way to ask schools, what are you doing about this? Is this equitable for students? Like, do they benefit from these courses, and what kinds of implementation are there? And I think that that's something that we've done a really good job with. Not to toot my own horn too much here, but essentially, we've covered. There was a Tennessee school where educators clearly were using online courses to remove problem students, including, at one point there was an email saying like, we have to just move them along, essentially. And that's the Anderson County School District, and specifically Clinton High School there in Tennessee. And essentially they were using Edgenuity, which was formerly called Odyssey-ware, and basically wanted to get students who are problematic to go to the next grade by giving them these courses, right? And so it shows like how these can be manipulated to just get students on a piece of paper or in the online reporting system, the reporting system, like to give them the grade that they need to get out. And that there was that comes amid a larger investigation for grade inflation, right? So there is some more nefarious stuff going on there, but that shows how that was used to actually manipulate those grades. And it can be so easy to do that, on a massive scale, right? To just change those grades. Also, Chicago Public Schools has a statement that says that virtual credit recovery can be equitable for students and provide them opportunities. But the research that Chalkboard News has talked about and investigated and spoken with researchers who say that it actually hurts students long term, that these online credit recovery programs follow students into the workforce. Like, they're not learning as much as their peers. And so what we're essentially doing in some of these cases, and not all cases, but in some cases, school districts are handing students an online program after they've already failed a course and saying you have to figure it out. And we've also reported on this year that research shows those online credit recovery courses are prone to cheating. It's something that we've covered a lot about, that you're able to pay somebody else to do your work for you. And they're also not challenging. So that's something that was interesting. Researchers actually were able to get a copy of some courseware and evaluate it. And they found that it would recycle the same questions so that students could basically memorize the answers. And so anyway, there's a lot of different facets of this. And I think that that's just something that maybe a lot of people aren't aware of, how easy it is to manipulate and to use these kinds of online credit recovery programs for potentially dubious ends.
Well, Brennan, thank you for your insights on these stories. Listeners can keep up with these stories and more at chalkboardnews.com.